It is never healthy to put your entire self-worth into one thing ever, ever. It's such a horrible idea. And we use the phrase like, don't put all your eggs in one basket, but I like a different phrase. So I have this example that I work with in my head and with patients that your life is like a bike wheel. So if you have a bike wheel, and I'm talking about like a pedal bike, obviously not like a vroom vroom bike, the more spokes you have on the bike wheel, the more likely you are to experience something stressful and be able to recover on the other end. So this bike wheel, all the spokes on your bike wheel, those are things that make up you. That's stuff like I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a worker, in this case, first responder, right? I play softball. I'm invested in my spiritual community. I invest in a volunteer organization, right? So if you have lots of spokes on your wheel, when you're pedaling, this is very cheesy. When you're pedaling through the road of life and you hit that pothole, you are more likely to be able to recover on the other side if you have a lot of things that make up you. If you start losing spokes on your wheel because you're no longer invested in your spiritual community, or you're no longer invested in maybe your marriage, or even really appropriately invested in other things that make you happy, volunteering, etc., you hit that pothole, you're in trouble. You're going to go flat pretty quickly.
He who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how. Dr. Jenny, what's this quote mean to you?
Oh my gosh. I think for me in the line of work I do, it really means that toughing it out, if you have a really good intent and something that's super important to you, you can accomplish almost anything.
Okay. So where did you first hear this and how do you apply it to what you do?
Sure. So actually, I've heard it basically from the Viktor Frankl works. So this is a man who went through horrific experiences and made it through those experiences by having deep personal value and meaning in those difficult experiences. And that's in line with the work I do now.
That's awesome. And just for familiarity with that, you can find out more Man Search for Meaning. Is that where you would drive them?
Absolutely. That's Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Mhm.
That's great. Yeah, that's one of the books I'm reading through right now. When did you read it?
Oh my gosh. Probably almost 10 to 12 years ago. I read it in graduate school.
Got it. Got it. Okay. And so so what's your specialty? It was graduate school, you went on, you're a doctor. So
Sure.
let's talk
Yeah.
about that aspect.
Yeah. I'm actually from Kansas City. And so I grew up, born and raised in Kansas City, and I got really lucky and I got into graduate school at the University of Kansas for the clinical psychology program. So I
Okay.
did my doctorate in clinical psychology, and that specialty there is primarily actually in health psychology. A lot of neuroscience, neuropsych stuff, and then how health affects your mental health. Basically, physical health affects mental health. I got hired on as I did my residency at the University of Kansas Medical Center in neurorehabilitation psychology, working with brain and spinal cord injury, which is actually my biggest fear in a weird way, is spinal cord injury. I'm a super active person, so I had to face that fear directly. But it also made me learn so much. And then I got hired on as faculty and I got placed at the KU Cancer Center, only really working with people who are pretty sick, mostly terminal cancer illness, which was not a good fit for my personality.
Okay.
God bless like palliative care and hospice nurses and folks like that that can do that. My mentality is I like to drive people forward towards change, and getting people prepared for dying was really hard. I made it through a few months and then just decided I got to find something else. And so I got back into trauma work. And now I work with first responders.
Tell us a little bit more about this. This is fascinating.
Yeah. So the first responder world, when I was working at some of my trauma stuff that I was doing at the medical center was spinal cord trauma, brain trauma, etc. I loved getting people better. So moving people from uncomfortable to at least being able to tolerate and manage their situation. It wasn't always changeable. Sometimes it was sitting with the distress, you have to, and being able to find new meaning in the distress you experience. Again, that's Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's work. After I left working with primarily terminally ill cancer folks, I moved into my own private practice doing work with first responders, mostly police officers, but I see a wide range too, firefighters, EMS personnel, paramedics, dispatchers, those folks too, and then also some ER physicians and nurses.
if I remember correctly, when we first met, you were like one of 200 or 300 people that does
Mhm.
what you do. Can you tell
Yes.
us those stats?
So there's not a lot of police psychologists in particular. So there's one kind of registering agency or body, and they have about 237 police psychologists through the country. It's not a it's not a huge field. You don't have a ton of us.
And you're significant because you train, like you help a lot of these people.
Yeah, so my role is very hands-on from everything from selecting candidates to become police officers, making sure that we have good people who can manage stress and also weeding out bad ones, of course. And then I work with them through really horrible, difficult moments. I work a lot of officer-involved shootings, manage really bad critical incidents, help them get through horrible things that they've seen and experienced, and then also help them get ready for retirement too. So the whole spectrum across kind of the lifespan of a career.
Interesting. And so I really wanted to pivot on that stress word you said, because that's really great. Now, there's another statistic, and why we're here talking to Feel Good Fathers is
Mhm.
that the percentage of fathers and men in police and in first responders in general maybe is
Yes.
pretty high. What's that stat again?
Yeah, so for police in particular, it's approximately 89 to 90% of people in law enforcement in particular are men. And
Got
so
it.
fire service actually even has less women, and then there's some other professions that are a little bit higher on the percentage of women. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So this is uniquely, so not uniquely, but it's very, very dominated by men. And so you work a lot with men, work a lot with fathers.
Mhm.
And then, so tell me a little bit about this first responder, this police officer, maybe in particular, that you
Yeah,
work with. Let's describe their life, and
sure.
then we'll talk about how we help them with stress.
Absolutely. So I would say that I have a really wide age range that I work with, a really diverse group. Now, mostly I would say 90% of my caseload is men and police officers.
Okay.
Um, I would say, let's see, I've got a few, like, kind of I call them baby cops. They're coming in young, like, brand new family, like, they've had 2 or 3 years into their career, and they've just started their brand new family, and that comes with unique stressors. And then I have people that have children that are in their teen years, so that officer might be, oh gosh, I don't know, in between, like, 35, 45 in there. And then oftentimes, I've got people that are working on getting out of the field together, and their children are up and grown. So, yeah. But the vast majority of people who gravitate towards law enforcement have a little bit more, I'd say, traditional family values in the sense that many of them have children and many of them are married, committed relationships, et cetera. There was a stat for a while that police officers had higher rates of divorce, and that's actually not true anymore. It was true way back when. It's not true anymore. It's about average to the national average.
And that's about 50%. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's weird. I've been hearing through the podcast world that that statistic actually isn't accurate, and
Yeah.
it's really hard to track down
It's
what
super
is
hard.
what is the actual
Mhm.
number of divorces.
Mm.
What I find fascinating in this particular area is is it would you say that once you get divorced, you're more likely to get another divorce, and so that
Yes.
statistic can increase? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it does.
And then another statistic that I heard that is really crazy is if you're in a peer group and one of the couples gets divorced, it's something like you're 2 or 3x more
Mm.
likely to get divorced because you're surrounded by people that are getting divorced. It's nuts. So what I love here is that we've got three core demographics, right? Newborn, new cop,
Mhm.
dealing in a high stress situation, a little bit more veteran,
Mhm.
right? With
Yeah.
teens and them having
Mhm.
stress. And then now we have retiring and leaving the stress world, trying to go into a different transition and phase of life.
Sure.
What would be unique and what would we see? Because you mentioned this,
Yeah.
the father has a unique set of stressors, right? So he's
Yes.
2 or 3 years into his career. He's the rook, loving the show right now.
Mhm.
Nathan Fillion, watching him on The Rookie. Love that show. What's a newborn dad? What's he go
Ah.
through?
Oh my gosh. First of all, you have to remember that police officers in particular, all first responders have horrific shift work schedules. And if you're new, you are probably gonna be working a crappy shift. So you're gonna be on midnights, and so your sleep is horrible, and if you have a newborn on top of that, that's pretty horrible as well. And so it's all the stressors at once. Like, being a new first responder is probably pretty fun. I think most people would say it's pretty great, pretty fun, because 'cause you're learning so many things and you're doing the things that are on television, right? But then when you've got a newborn at home and you're not getting sleep, and then you're going into high stress situations, oh man, the pressure is intense, and then you're really not getting sleep. One of the things that we know that makes people not cope with stress very well is obviously poor sleep. Can't really control that type of lack of sleep, but yeah. So
How would you work with and what would you say to a father or one
sure.
of your clients to
Mhm.
handle this?
Yeah, sure, sure. So I think one of the things that I always start out with is talking about the importance of kind of the bond that you have with your spouse, and
Okay.
making sure that your spouse really understands exactly the type of stressors you're experiencing. And then also realize that just because you're under the high stress condition, your spouse is having their own experience related to your high stress condition and then having a new child. I think sometimes I know this, Jay, sometimes when we get under extreme stress, we get really self-absorbed. We don't necessarily mean to, it's a natural tendency. So when we are feeling resource scarce, feeling like we don't necessarily have enough even mental, emotional, or even physical resources, it is natural to start to kind of turn inward and only think about, well, I've got to save myself right now. Even fathers, even parents will do that.
Interesting. So how would you solve that? What would it's an
Ooh,
oversimplification, right?
solve. Yeah.
Yeah, let's solve it. Let's solve the problem right now. What what would be a step that
Sure.
somebody could take to ameliorate the situation?
Sure. So some of the stuff I talk about right away is making sure that the spouse is really aware, obviously, of what we talked about, that there is a lot of high stress out there. The other thing I say is you're going to have to start to learn to say no to some stuff. So you're going to have to start to learn to politely decline lots of things that maybe you would have really liked to do. It's a prioritization of your time. There's only so many hours in the day. So you just got to think about making sure that when you say yes to something, that you're really making a conscious choice and being honest with, can I say yes to this thing right now?
That's really good because I know, especially for young fathers, and I would say young men in general, so 25 to 35-ish, like that 10-year range, we tend to be a little bit more self-driven. We tend to be
Sure.
a little bit hungrier, tend to be a little bit more my world, my goals, my empire, I got to build it. And so that's a really interesting that is a good first step towards having much more awareness of your personal impact as a father on the people in your life, on your family, your
100%.
spouse, your kids, etc. Okay,
Mhm.
fantastic. So be
Mhm.
very aware of what you're saying yes to, be very aware of what you're saying no to.
Yes.
So our teen dads. So now we're talking about dads, 40s, probably 50s. What how does it show up for them?
So usually how that shows up for them is, and this is, I hope people understand this is not a knock on the personality type that gets into any kind of the careers like this, but you are exposed to the worst of the worst or bad things that can happen to other people. When your kids, your most prized thing in your life, the thing you usually value the most, move into their teen phase, which includes, of course, testing limits, not
Mhm.
being under as much control, etc. Many times, parents that are exposed to the worst of things that can happen to people, they will get really anxious and they will take their anxiety. And oftentimes, it doesn't come out as expressing anxiety, it comes out as expressing anger. Anger is, I don't remember who said this line, but so I'm quoting someone else's, anger is a great anesthetist. And so it
Mm.
will cover up really uncomfortable things. So powerlessness, lack of control, anxiety. And so sometimes I will see teen dads or dads that have teens be more angry and express anger instead of learning how to express maybe what's underneath that anxiety or under that anger.
I think this is really great for any feel good father to listen
Mhm.
to, in that, especially as men, part of what I've come to understand is that men deal traditionally with two things. There's two big emotions that we have to learn how to control. The first being anger and rage, the second being lust and desire. And
Mhm.
having control and having an awareness around those two emotions, you can become more powerful, more self aware, and have a much more positive and For me, the goal would be a calm or temperate impact on those around you, what we would consider the traditional positive paternal masculine traits. Okay. The outward expression is anger, blowing
Mhm.
up, yelling, discipline, arguments, everything you would see in that household. But there's an underlying element here. Men do very poorly at understanding their own emotions. It's just where we are. We know that we have them. And I don't think that's the correct route, isn't saying that men don't have them. We just don't know how to healthily express them.
Sure.
How do you work with men at this stage to help them with understanding their emotion, healthily expressing their emotion? And let's do it from a higher level. And then also, hey, what's one or two things they can do like today, right now, to get in touch with that?
Sure. So I think it's important to realize that when people are exposed to a lot of trauma and a lot of high stress situations, there is an adaptive mechanism for numbing out emotions. It is a survival mechanism. It is not healthy to be going call to call, stressful situation to stressful situation, and be feeling everything all the time. So that is somewhat adaptive in the moment. The problem is that when we get back home, we can't turn them back on very easily. The emotional system is a slower system. So it's not like attention where I can turn my attention to one direction and then the other.
What do
It's a
you what do
much,
you
yeah.
mean? What do you
Yeah.
mean by the emotional system is a slower system? I've never heard that
Yeah.
before.
It takes a long time to ramp it up and down. So if I am feeling super angry, or maybe let's go with numb. Let's go with numb. So we have to numb out when we're under high stress conditions or high pressure situations. Because if we felt all our feelings, we would be able to focus. By the time you have your drive home from your long workday that's super stressful, it's going to take longer for your system to move from numbed out to I'd like to feel now. Well, sometimes that has to be intentional for some people. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's not a immediate thing. You have to give it a ramp up period and a ramp down period. So I tell a lot of people, getting to a tip here, I tell a lot of people to be really mindful and thoughtful on their drives home. What emotion are you at right now? And what do you want to walk in the door at home with? What's the emotion you want? Do you want to be angry when you walk in the door? Do you want to be disconnected when you walk in the door? Or be intentional and say, hey, I want to be present, I want to be attached, and I want to be ready and available to take in what my kids or my spouse is trying to communicate with me.
I know from my past that you can anchor some of these emotions or transitions either with a physical anchor. I call that body anchoring. I think of like the learning modalities, a song or a sentence or an affirmation or something like
Yes.
that. Is there any, you mentioned that you
Yeah.
did neuroscience. Is there any
Yeah.
reality? Is this real? Can you do that?
Yes. So as many senses as you can bring in to help you get into a certain mind state, the better. So if it's like a picture, for example, many of my officers will carry around a picture of their kiddo or make sure that they always have a picture of their kiddo kind of sitting up on their dash or somewhere in their control panel of their personal car on the way home so they can tap into, hey, I'm coming home to this, leave the rest of it right here emotionally. I want to tap into this when I get in. So obviously, yes, pulling in as many senses as possible to get you to switch.
Got it. Step one being acknowledge that you're in the high stress situation.
Mhm.
Step two being have some sort of anchor or preparation, having a buffer between that trauma, that stress,
Yes.
and how you want to show up in your world.
Yes, and be disciplined about it. So, like, some of my guys and gals, they'll come home from a shift and I'll say, "What kind of music were you playing in your car on the way home?" And they'll be like, "Rage Against the Machine," and I'm like, "How about we switch that up?
Yep. Yep.
Let's try something else."
Love
I
it.
know it
Love it.
I know it felt good in the moment. I'm sure felt really great to get that out, but it didn't switch you to where you wanted to be. So,
Yes. Got it. So that intentionality, absolutely dig it.
yeah.
Now we've got older fathers, retirees. So that they're winding down, they're entering the next phase transition of their life. How do we, what are some things that they can navigate that they should be aware of?
So the biggest issue I see, and this is not for everyone, of course, is relevancy. When you have to think about, like, this is oftentimes a phase where not only are people ending out their really high stress, high importance careers where they are making a pretty big difference on a day-to-day basis, but they're making life or death decisions on a day-to-day basis. And then once they move towards rounding their career out or actually getting ready to retire, which, by the way, if you're in public safety, um, kind of how the system is usually set up in most states, you can retire by the time you're 55 and you can have a whole nother career first of all, if you want to. But the other thing is you go from being very capable and being able to access a ton of information, being able to be in the know all the time, and then also making really big decisions to making some of the biggest decisions are like, what am I going to have for breakfast? And so you go from like this high intensity situation to almost like a sense of what's my value, what's my importance. And then at the same time, for a lot of people, people's children are leaving the home. So they're also transitioning out of that day-to-day father role to more of a, hey, I'm here if you need me, kind of playing catch, just waiting. So
It makes so much sense why you're leaning on Viktor Frankl. Where you're what I'm hearing is this complete transition and loss of purpose.
yeah.
That how? What do we do here? What
Yeah.
as a
What do
feel
we
good
do?
father, what do you do?
Okay, so here's something I talk about all the time. It is never healthy to put your entire self-worth into one thing ever, ever. It's such a horrible idea. And we use the phrase like, don't put all your eggs in one basket, but I like a different phrase. So I have this example that I work with in my head and with patients that your life is like a bike wheel. So if you have a bike wheel, and I'm talking about like a pedal bike, obviously not like a vroom vroom bike, the more spokes you have on the bike wheel, the more likely you are to experience something stressful and be able to recover on the other end. So when people only, and so let me back up and say, so this bike wheel, all the spokes on your bike wheel, those are things that make up you. That's stuff like I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a worker, in this case, first responder, right? I play softball. I'm invested in my spiritual community. I invest in a volunteer organization, right? So if you have lots of spokes on your wheel, when you're pedaling, this is very cheesy. When you're pedaling through the road of life and you hit that pothole, you are more likely to be able to recover on the other side if you have a lot of things that make up you. If you start losing spokes on your wheel because you're no longer invested in your spiritual community, or you're no longer invested in maybe your marriage, or even really appropriately invested in other things that make you happy, volunteering, etc., you hit that pothole, you're in trouble. You're going to go flat pretty quickly. And so that's how we get through change, I would say, is making sure that we're really, really invested in a lot of different things that make us us. So when one of those spokes gets a little weak sometimes, we have all these other things to rely on.
You said appropriately invested into things that make you happy. So everybody that we're talking about right now, even feel good fathers, right? We are adding things to our life that are in the time block of that 16 hours or
Mhm.
less per day is chunking away.
Yes.
What is appropriate fun? What does that look like?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because there's things that are like really not going to give you back as much as you want them to. So binge watching Netflix is not, I know it might feel good in the moment. It is not going to give you a nice reward long term. There's kind of like a grading system on what's going to be more likely to more healthy, I guess I would say. I'm going to use a food analogy. So let's say if you binge watch Netflix, that's like being hungry and grabbing Twinkies. It's going to help you in the short term, but it's not going to help you long term. You're going to
Mhm.
have a blood sugar spike and crash, and you're going to be just as craving something else later. If you're grabbing something healthy with protein and the good mix of protein and carbs, like a salad and chicken, you might not necessarily want that at the beginning, but it's going to last you longer and you're going to feel better longer. So we got to
What, ki-
think about that. Yeah.
what kind of activities are steak?
Sure. I like it. I like it. Yes. First of all, we do know that anything that drives social connection and like lots of interaction is stake, basically. So that's stuff like making sure that you're not just passively participating, you have to actively engage with other people. So passive participation is stuff like binge watching Netflix,
Mm,
right?
mhm.
Um, Active participation is things like involving yourself in a men's group or involving yourself in some kind of volunteer activity where there's a bouncing back and forth between people. Those
Got it.
by far are the best.
So from a neuro perspective, this is any activity that gives you vasopressin or oxytocin, right? Traditionally have more vasopressin receptors. So being able to solve a problem or
Mhm.
accomplish a goal, anything that would give you fiero is a better activity for you as a man, right? And
Yes. Yeah.
love it. Okay. We were talking before about trauma and
Yeah.
how trauma shows up. Like, what does it
Mhm.
actually look like? And you had some pictures that you wanted to share of this.
Mhm.
Uh, let's cue that up for our feel good fathers, what that looks like.
Yeah. So let me go first into, if you don't mind, I'm going to go into exactly like what is trauma, right? So I will tell you, I think that there's a little bit of a trend in our society to call everything trauma. And that is not really what I'm talking about. So we have stress. And we have stress, and that's actually not necessarily good or bad. We have stressors, but when the stressors pull us into an area where we start to feel like we can't emotionally, physiologically, or cognitively manage them, and usually they have some kind of other like life altering aspect to them. So they change our perspective on how we view the world. That's when I really think about trauma. That's kind of the world I work in, is the stuff that vastly changes your perception of safety in the world, power and control in the world, connection in the world. Those are the types of things I usually work with. Just, be mindful that yes, there's stress and then there's trauma, and there's a big difference there. So, um, so I also like to think of trauma like I think of body weight. So follow me on this analogy real quick. You think about body weight, and you can be 5 pounds overweight and you would barely notice, right? And maybe your pants fit a little tight. You can be 500 pounds overweight and it can take it can take you out, right? You're feeling that from the moment you sit up in bed, that you're 500 pounds overweight and everything is difficult, from getting out of bed to walking downstairs, all that kind of stuff. Trauma, mental trauma, I think of very similar to body weight. You can have 5 pounds of trauma and you might not ever notice. Honestly, it might just be a one-off that you notice. And then you can have 500 pounds of trauma and it's the first thing that comes to mind, the first thing you feel in your world from the moment you wake up. And it also can take a human life, just 500 pounds of being overweight can. So that's how I think about it. So when I talk to people about trauma, I talk about the importance of kind of keep it down to as close to 0 pounds overweight as possible in this example. I don't want people to freak out and think, like, oh, I have a little bit of trauma, it's going to ruin me as a parent. That is not the case, actually. A little bit of trauma, I'm very flippant with it and say it's like seasoning. It's like, all right, it's just the right amount of seasoning. It gives you some character. But I think sometimes we get real dramatic about, like, oh my gosh, I'm so screwed up, I'll never be able to recover. No, come on, let's just be realistic here. A little bit of seasoning is not always bad. So,
I
mhm,
love it. And so we
mhm.
were discussing that in the past. We were talking about the picture and what that looks like.
Yeah,
And now I'm understanding your mental model with this.
yeah,
So
yeah.
what are these 3 areas that you want to talk about?
Sure. So there are 3 ways I would say that the traumatized parent shows up in parenting. And I'm not going to get into every single symptom of trauma, but I'll say this, like, there are certain symptoms of trauma that will make you disengaged and numb. There are other certain symptoms of trauma that will make you look really overreactive and on edge. And then the third kind of section here is symptoms that make you look like both, but it's unpredictable. So you can bounce from one category to the other. So we have our numb and disengaged, and then we have our hyperreactive and overengaged, and then we have unpredictable. So that's how it shows up in parenting. So that's like the simplest way I can describe it. Now, of course, there's nuances in between there. So let's talk about the disengaged, numbed out parent. So one of the things that happens with trauma, depending on kind of a whole bunch of factors, is you can start to isolate quite a bit. You want to control your environment more, so you pull away from the things that are important to you. You can also kind of want to make sure that you don't expose yourself as weak or vulnerable. So then you pull away and you isolate even more. And then I talked about this earlier already, but that numbness thing, that emotional numbness as a survival mechanism. Some people really truly do believe, and so this is true for a few people, not the majority, that if I don't completely shut off my emotions, I will have an uncontrolled fountain of emotions that will damage everyone around me. And so that is
So
one way. Yeah.
would you say that this numbness, in addition to be a self-preservation ability, that a father might choose to stay numb because
Mhm.
they don't have control of their emotions, they don't have control of the situation, they don't know how they're reacting. So they're saying,
Yeah.
so they're making the false choice of saying, by staying numb, I'm not hurting my family.
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
And
And
it's
that's
it's
not
not
correct.
no, no,
Right.
no, it's inaccurate because there's damage that comes from each of these. So that's,
Right.
it's the numbed out, traumatized parent. So then if
Okay.
we move to the reactive parent, that's someone that everything is grating on their last nerve. So life is uncomfortable all the time. And because of that, their emotions are usually reactive and all over the place all the time. And they're always trying to overcorrect or overfix everything. If I just work a little bit harder, maybe I won't feel this way. Or if I have everything perfect in my environment, maybe I won't feel this way. Or if my kids will just be quiet, I won't have all these symptoms and I can finally function.
Mm.
That's your reactive parent. That has its own way in which it can affect parenting. Then there's the unpredictable parent, which is where you bounce from bank to bank here. And so instead of being predictable, at least you're predictable and numb or predictable and reactive. You sometimes are numb and disengaged and sometimes really reactive. And that is actually one of the harder things for kids is when they don't have a predictable parent in the environment.
Mm. Okay. How does this show up? Let's suppose that we're in this. What are we looking for as a father
Mhm.
in our kids? So talk about our kids
Sure.
first, and maybe we'll talk about what we can see in our spouse.
Sure, absolutely. So let's talk about, I'm going to go through all three again real quick. So the numbed out parent because of trauma. So that's a disengaged and uninvolved parent. And we know that kids will do anything for attention.
Okay.
And you can either get good attention or bad attention. And I always make a joke, slash not really that funny, that oftentimes traumatized parents' kids look one of two ways. They either look like absolute overachievers, look at all the cool things they did so that they can get attention that way. Or if they can't get attention for that stuff, they look like dumpster fires. They're just doing things that they need attention for, usually bad things at that point. That is the downstream effect of being the checked out parent. The checked
What is
out
it?
parent, yeah.
What does it look like for? So those are the two undesirable negative associations and behaviors. What does it look like on the positive side? So let's paint a hopeful image just real quick.
Yes. Oh, please, please. Yes. Well, yeah, it's not all bad. The parent that is really aware of how to manage their trauma symptoms and aware that they have the trauma symptoms and how they affect them, that parent is communicating, hey, dad's having a bad day today. We're going to get through it. I'm going to do this to help me get through it. You want to participate in it? Or, hey, give me about 5 minutes. I'm going to turn this around. The healthy parent is modeling how to manage bad emotion.
And
That, yeah.
kids are parrots and models of their
Oh,
parents.
yeah, painfully. Yes.
Got it.
Good
Got
and
it.
bad.
Okay. So by moving past numb, hyperreactive, or unpredictable, we're modeling the fact that number one, it's okay to have negative emotions.
Yes.
Number two, that it's okay to communicate that we're having good and bad emotions.
Yeah.
And number three, coping mechanisms to stay in the moment and keep the peace, so to speak.
Yep. You got it. Perfect.
Great. So when you're hyperreactive,
Mhm.
how does that, sorry. Let's go back to numb. So you're numb.
Yeah.
What does it look like for your spouse? What do we see in the spouse?
There you go. So spouses will start to feel extremely disconnected and almost resentful. So when you are avoiding life because of trauma symptoms, because you don't want to get activated, oftentimes what will happen is the spouse will get really, really, honestly, usually it's just resentful, I'll say at the end of the day. Now, getting to resentful can look a little different ways. Sometimes they will be immediately disengaged from you because of your emotions, but then the other times they'll try to like fight with you a little bit to say, hey, what's going on with you? Let's get this figured out. They feel more anxious. Either way, though, at the end, it ends in resentment. And
Yeah.
and disengagement. So they start pulling away from each other.
Got it. So you end up you're just co-locating. You're just cohabitating in the house. No
Yeah,
relationship there. Got it.
absolutely.
All right. Hyperreactive.
Oh boy. Yeah. So this is the parent. This is the yeller parent. This is the parent that one of the unfortunate things about trauma that people don't really realize is when you're traumatized and your nervous system's very activated all the time. That's what happens with people who have post-traumatic stress disorder in particular. Even like changes in light or sound or movement can set you off because it's unpredictable. So the ice maker going off in the other room all of a sudden is sending the traumatized parent into a rage, right? And then what happens is everyone starts to operate around you. So how this looks is now spouse and children are spending extra energy and effort to try to keep you calm, which is not healthy at all. Not at all. That creates all sorts of emotional codependency stuff. So they think now that they are responsible for your mood. because you just react all of a sudden. Like, they will walk into a room and say, "Hey, dad." And you're like, "What? What do you want now?" You have just modeled for that kid that just merely showing up is a stressor. So now that kid is going to say, "I am a stressor," because kids don't have the ability to realize that's dad's thing, this is my thing. Kids in particular, all the way up through adolescence, honestly, will look at that interaction and say, "I am a problem. I am the issue. This isn't a co-issue, or this isn't a him issue. I'm the problem." And so then you're going to have all sorts of issues with kids being hyper anxious in particular, I would say, also hyper vigilant, emotionally hyper vigilant. So they're scanning the environment for emotional threats. When's dad going to flip out? It's horribly bad. I would say that one is extremely detrimental, and like training your kids, unfortunately, for some anxiety down the road, potentially clinically. Yeah.
Got it. And then how about for the spouse?
Yeah. That's avoidance. If you are thinking to yourself, there's absolutely nothing I can do to control the situation with my husband, you're going to start to avoid, or you're going to start to do everything to people please. And really what you're just doing is like pacifying the current situation, but never getting anywhere. So at all. And again, I'm going to go back to resentment. Long term, that leads to resentment. Long term. Yeah.
Got it. All right. And now there seemed to be a star next to unpredictable. So let's talk about
Yeah.
unpredictable a little bit.
I would say, and even the attachment literature and how we attach in parent-child interaction supports us too. We all need at least some degree of predictability in our lives. That is a psychological need, 101 psychological need. And so when you have some parent that's going to be checked out and numb, and then when they do show up, they're super reactive, people are going to be walking on eggshells. And what I have to talk to my clients about sometimes is, hey, technically, by you doing that unpredictable emotional thing, I know you're not intending it to be, but it's a manipulation. You're basically saying, whatever I need right now, react to me. So I need to be left alone. That's that. And now I'm going to show up, but I'm going to show up because I'm here to argue with you, or I'm here to force you to fix whatever's in my environment that's bothering me. And so it can be manipulative. And so that is horribly anxiety provoking for both spouse and child in particular. And then also eventually people aren't going to want to be around you if it's that unpredictable. And so then they're going to start withdrawing from you, which is going to lead the traumatized parent to think, "Oh man, I am really that bad. I am really that unwanted, unloved, unhelpful, meaningless." And that's not good for anybody in that relationship.
Because what we've taught then is the same thing that the father is going through here, is that the father is not able to take care of their own needs. And so now we're forcing the family to take care of the father's needs, and therefore they don't know how to take care of their own needs. And now we have a
Correct.
cycle,
Correct.
just a cycle of trauma and stress and unhealthy attachment.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Unpredictability is hard, really hard.
Got it. All right. What's the opposite? What's our goal here as feel good fathers? What do we want to create?
So what we're trying to create, first of all, is if you've got legitimate trauma symptoms, you have got to get to a professional. You have to. The longer this goes on, the worse it gets. I mean, so that's where we have to get you to a spot where you can start working on it. What we're trying to aim for is being able to take your story that you have around what happened to you and be able to make meaning out of it that's healthy. Like I think it's really important to write the story around your trauma so that it works for you as best as it possibly can. Not like this horrible thing happened to me and look how miserable it made me. Your goal is to move into this bad thing happened to me, and here's how it's made me stronger.
Whatever didn't kill me made me stronger.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So what's the goal for our family?
I think the goal for your family is to be able to, a healthy family has a lot of individuality and everyone is respected for their individuality, but then also we can have a cohesive unit as well. So it's a nice balance between all those things. Yeah.
Got it. So in the moment, we are understanding our emotion. We're understanding the state that we're in. We are choosing which state we want to be in, how we want to show up, really critically important. And that action, that interaction is resiliency. So
Yes.
we were discussing a resilient family and
Yeah.
what and steps and stuff like that around that piece. Let's queue up
Mhm.
resilient family, and how do we, as feel good fathers, what are some
Yeah.
things we can learn from everything we talked about here today,
Mhm.
and acknowledge that, hey, we might have trauma.
Mhm.
More than likely, we have stressors.
Yeah.
How do we? Let's move forward. What is that?
Yes.
What's that purpose look like?
Yes. So, resilient families communicate and collaborate. So that's like the easiest, simplest, cleanest way for me to say it. Now, how we get there is obviously a process, but it has all different elements. But for example, we know that if people have excellent social support and they experience another trauma, if they have really solid social support, they are way less likely to develop trauma symptoms. In fact, when we study like trauma post natural disaster, let's say tornado, earthquake, etc., here's the stats on this. So if you have really strong social support and you have a really strong family unit with great social connections and you feel an intimate bond with the people in your life, if you experience a trauma, you have about a 2% chance of developing post-traumatic stress disorder. If you have weak social relationships, or weak connections, or weak intimacy with your family, you have a 12% chance of developing trauma symptoms after a natural disaster.
So that's 1 in 50 versus 1 in 10.
It's huge, actually. And in like kind of psychology and social psychology literature, those are actually gigantic stat differences there.
Right.
So, yeah. So, social connection prevents further trauma, I would say for sure. But then having a solid social support system before anything bad actually ever happens, if you can, is ideal. So, that goes back to the family too. You want to have as many close relationships with your family as possible, as many diverse close relationships as possible. So, I use this analogy. It's really not a great idea to start working on your social connections in the midst of a trauma or amidst of a high stress situation. It's actually much better to have them all in place before the stressful thing happens. It's if a tornado is coming, and by the way, the tornado is life in general, anything that's high intensity coming at you, you should probably have built the storm shelter before the tornado gets there.
So this is interesting because a lot of feel good fathers, they come into fatherhood thinking that they have to, as we were talking about time blocking and managing your time, that they have to get rid of things in their life. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm a father now. I'm a husband now. I have to cut out certain elements. And I think there's a certain, I think an evaluative metric there would be if the people that you're hanging out with only do the things that you used to do. So for instance, if your only friend circle goes out and gets drunk every night to do play pickup or something like that, and now you're married or now you have a kid, you might want to up level your peer group.
Mhm.
I think that in a certain area, and I'm sure that you would agree, you want to have good, healthy outlets, is what
Yes.
you're saying, like good, healthy
Yeah.
peer groups.
Yeah.
And when you were talking, the image that came to me was life is a series of you're in the wheel of life using your bike and cycle analogy, and there's a rut that you'll hit in the road. You almost want to extend the new spoke down into that rut to say, like, oh, here's something we can learn. Let's
Yes.
build a new peer group out of this or a new connection. What
Yes.
is this statistically or numbers, if you have them? What does this look like? Like healthy? What is this? Is this
Mm.
three different peer groups? Is it, there's a model of the wheel of life? Is it you have one peer group per area of wheel of life, spirituality, work, family, et cetera, friends? What are some models here we can take a look at?
Sure. So I'll be honest with you, the research here is fairly thin and everyone is different. I would say it's not necessarily the number, although I would say more than one would be better just for merely playing your odds. I would say that the depth is more important than the number. So if you have one particular friend group that it's extremely close, um, maybe just I hate to be so practical about it, but you have one backup group too, that you've also
Right.
really worked on those well. If for some reason you're not finding that you can find really super deep relationships with one specific peer group, then you might need to look at developing two more or three more. So it's I don't think it's the number per se as much as the depth and strength.
Okay.
Sorry, it's
That's
not a simple answer, but
no, it's good. I think but I think what's really clear here is that it's very important to have, how would we describe this? Folks that
so
you're leaning on that are leaning on you.
yes. And here's another thing, like sometimes when I teach about this, because I do a lot of teaching about the importance of kind of making sure you're resilient ahead of trauma, because a lot of the work that I do, people are exposed to hundreds of critical incidents in their lives. So I do this exercise when I'm teaching brand new baby cops, and I say, "Hey, I want you to think of the last stressful situation that you were in, really stressful situation, and I want you to list that situation on top of a piece of paper, and then I want you to list every name of everybody that was involved in helping you get through it." And so what they start to realize is that each person filled a different role for them. So they would have like maybe a mentor figure that helped them walk through the basics of understanding what's probably going to happen next, like somebody who's a few steps ahead in the journey, right? And then they had another friend maybe that was more able to just listen to them vent. And then they had another friend that was more likely to say, "Hey, you ran that result by me and I'm just, or that plan by me. And I'm just going to be real honest with you. That seems wonky. Like it's not going to work." You have the honesty friend, you have the mentor friend, and you have the venting friend. And if you don't have some of these niches or these roles filled because you only have one close person in your life, it's going to be much harder to get through difficult times coming up.
I love this idea of an inventory,
Yeah.
that a lot of what we're talking about is just being aware of where you're at and what you want to create. And I think that a really solid, very practical step here is just taking a look at your relationships, who's actually in your life. And that can open up great doors: awareness, gratitude, outreach. I think of John Israel, Mr. Thank You, and thank you notes. I think of, in our circle, we talk a lot about writing thank you notes, writing Christmas cards. Who's on your Christmas list, right? These are all people that have had some sort of impact in your life. The other aspect I love of what you just said was that not everybody, or not any, a better way to say this, not any one person is the Swiss Army knife. And that it's completely okay to have different needs met from different individuals. Uh, I'm sure that there's something to say here about your relationship with your spouse. Do you have any
Yes.
opinions on whether or not your spouse should be a Swiss Army knife?
That is a recipe for disaster if you view your spouse as a Swiss Army knife. It's just bad. I promise you, they will let you down. That is just silly. That
What?
is just, yeah.
So let's go from abstract to, this is the way that I think about it. So
Yeah.
we talked about anger and lust, right? So if you're, uh, I think of the lust fight for men as a spiritual battle.
Okay.
So I would be like, oh, if I'm having any issue with that, I would go talk to my pastor about that. I wouldn't necessarily, because I'm sure that might bring up something in my spousal relationship.
Correct.
With anger, it might be better to go talk to, I might say, hey, wife, I'm angry about something right now. And in fact, with my newborn, stuff like that, I have a low level of just general anger going on right now from lack of sleep. That's just how it shows up for me.
Yeah.
So she's like, hey, you're kind of grumpy. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Let's talk about the feel good father, right? Are there any particular examples or any particular areas that you would suggest that they pursue a different need at different relationships, or is it just kind of like figure out who you are and figure out your relationships?
I think that I think that there's a degree of intentionality that you can have, but you don't want to have too much intentionality because we can't force these things. Like I use myself as an example. I am an extremely direct, forthright type of person and very and therapist, honestly. So I'm probably not the person to come to for a lot of validation. I'm probably more the person like, "Hey, Dr. Jenny's gonna take your problem. She's gonna lay out a roadmap." That's my thing, right? And I can fake the validation and I can fake but I'm not good at it. I'll be honest with you. I'm not. And so I think it's really important that you just take the people in front of you and be realistic about what they can truly bring to you and don't force it. Don't force it. Don't try to make, your spouse, for example, into this really empathetic person if they're actually just not that. They're the problem solver person. And don't try to make your empathetic friend into the problem solver. Just accept people where they're at, but also go seek better relationships or develop better relationships with the people you think have the characteristics that you're looking for.
When you say better, do you mean deeper? Just keep
Deeper.
deeper.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Awesome. Absolutely love it. What a fantastic set of, not only of a conversation, but practical guides and things to talk about, things to pursue. Dr. Jenny, if folks want to learn more about you, if they want to get more into what you're doing, they want to reach out in some way, how can they
Sure.
do that? Where can they go?
Sure. Okay. So I've got social media right now is probably one angle to start with. So it's the first responder psychologist, both at on Instagram and Facebook. But then I've got a really cool program that we're doing right now about building resiliency, especially in brand new officers and other first responders that are super stressed. And that's tacticallongevity.com. And through there, you can reach out and get in touch with us. Yeah,
Awesome. Dr. Jenny, thank you so much.
absolutely. Thank you. I was so excited. This was great.
Awesome. Great. Hey, Feel Good Fathers, hit that like button to let YouTube know that you liked this video. Comment below with your thoughts and reactions to this interview. I really want to hear what you have to say. As a personal brand strategist, I hear all the time about coaches, trainers, speakers, and authors doing the right thing, but at the wrong time. We specialize in helping brand builders have more impact, more credibility and clarity, and developing an overall brand strategy. When you work with Brand Builders Group, we'll help you do the right thing at the right time. Request a free brand call below. There's a link in the description. And don't forget to subscribe. You'll get updates when the new episodes are launched, and it really helps out the community and the channel. We'll see you next time.